Hello and welcome to Daily Debrief. I'm Pragya and today on our show, the perplexing COVID situation. Infection numbers remain high, but global responses seem to have changed. Afghan diplomats in the United States find themselves in a strange in-between zone. And football, the fiercest proponents of market economics are singing some very different tunes today. First, COVID cases. If we look at the global COVID-19 case count, the number of cases today are currently higher than the peak figures of the earlier wave last year. The current figure is 1.5 million, higher than when we were just coming down from what we then saw as the peak. And there is also a new uptick in some countries in the United Kingdom, Europe and Southeast Asia. We have Prabir Purkasa here with us to discuss the situation. Prabir, what is your assessment of the COVID pandemic today from looking at the numbers?
You see, it's very clear that Omicron variant, which is the dominant variant today that we see in different parts of the world, is much more transmissible. And therefore, the numbers of transmissions that are taking place still continue to be high. And though we are saying the wave is over, because it's much less than what the Omicron wave was earlier. So therefore, it seems to be we are in a zone of relative confidence that, okay, it's over. But the real issue is that, without taking into account the current uptick, the real issue is the number of deaths or the hospital cases, both have come down at the level of the shall we say, the drop of the numbers that we saw in the earlier peaks, the troughs of those numbers. So the troughs are roughly similar, though the number in terms of deaths, though the number of cases are relatively still high.
What does that mean, Prabir?
So what it means is that if I am a normal person, I say, okay, I'll get a little sick and so on, but I won't die. And why are the deaths lower? Is because we have two things. We have, of course, vaccines. So people have got 2 doses, lots of places you've got even the booster doses. So a lot of people have vaccines, so there is a certain kind of vaccine-induced immunity as well as past infection-induced immunity. So both kinds of immunities exist. So the people who already have some immunity, and this was something which the immunologists had pointed out much earlier, or the epidemiologists, that we are not no longer naive in population. Naive meaning that our body hasn't seen the virus. So now our body has seen the virus in various ways, either through vaccine or direct infection, or very mild infection which I didn't even know had happened. So we have now different kinds of immunities in the population, and therefore we don't see the kind of numbers that we saw earlier in terms of serious cases. And again, we shouldn't take this lightly because it has a lot of other complications that we know. It triggers various other things, a COVID infection. So even though it may not manifest itself in the way that we take a serious case, basically lung, we're getting compromised and so on, but it still has other ramifications, long COVID that we are talking about. So it's still something that we have to think about. So the idea that everything is hunky-dory, we can go about freely, mix as much as you want, no masking required, these are dangerous. So yes, we need to look at what's happening. We don't have to look at it in terms of the curfew principle. We should look at it from the point of view of the public health policies, that if the things start again to see an uptick. We see it in, for instance, South Korea, we see it in Hong Kong, we see it in Southeast Asia, certain countries. We see it in Europe, for instance, Western Europe, Germany, some numbers going up in other places also. So given all of that, we have to see it that where we are at this moment and react accordingly. We shouldn't think that, we should celebrate the end of COVID-19. It is not the end. We still haven't reached the end state. Even if you're moving towards it, we still cannot say all things are over and we have now won over COVID-19 and we are, safe home. It's not that situation. And we don't know what the next variant might emerge. After all, Omicron completely blindsided us. It's possible that we get something new and we have to react again accordingly.
Right. Prabir, a curious development of late, the cases in China seem very low, but the sense that you get if you read the papers is that China is the hub of COVID, etc., etc. Can you explain what China's policy is, what they're doing, and why this outrage over China's 4,000 cases?
4,000, 5,000 depending
Right.
days. You see, of course, Hong Kong is a separate example. It was not really integrated into the no COVID policy that China had induced. It's a no COVID policy that we really have locked down apart. If we see there is COVID-19 over there, this kind of policies no other country has successfully followed. New Zealand tried it, but it doesn't seem to have succeeded either. Sort of now we can see other countries also which have tried no COVID policies giving it up. China still continues to follow it. And the kind of resources they put, they can test a city of 10 million people in a matter of days. Those no other country has the ability or the will to do it. So I think China in that sense, wanting a no COVID policy itself is an exception. Therefore, if you take 5,000 people getting infected, for them it's a huge thing, and it means locking down 16 million people for a week so that they can test everybody, see who exactly are infected, what are the localities where this is there, isolate only that, and then target only areas where you can see COVID so that you can control the numbers and also protect the rest of the population. It means a very close cooperation between the local communities, their organizations and the governments. And I think they have been able to do that, along with the ability to mobilize 10, 15 million people being tested in a few days. That's no other country has the ability to do it. But yes, for no COVID policy, it's a challenge. For looking at numbers, everybody will say, oh, 5,000, 1.5 billion people is nothing. But it's how you look at the problem and how you look at the solution that why 5,000 for China is a big thing. And of course, a lot of papers are not reading the numbers. So they're not looking at the numbers, but looking at China's reaction. Oh, it's gone up so much and so on.
All right. Prabir, there have been significant developments on the vaccine front as well. Can you tell us about the open source vaccine in particular, but also other vaccines? What can we expect?
Well, you see, there's a large number of vaccines now available on the market. And if you take the ones that we know about, of course, we have the COVAX vaccine, AstraZeneca's vaccine, which Serum Institute in India manufactures. Basically, I would call it the Oxford vaccine. Then you have the mRNA vaccines, which are being pushed by the United States, the Pfizer vaccine and the Moderna vaccines. Pfizer is actually BioNTech vaccine from Germany, but that's how the people perceive it to be, as a Pfizer vaccine, because they bought the worldwide rights. Now, looking at all of these vaccines, they have their proprietary vaccines. That means only some countries have the intellectual property to manufacture it. And even when Moderna had said their mRNA vaccine can be open source and they won't charge patent fees, but when South Africa has talked about manufacturing it, they have not been forthcoming. So there are obviously patent-protected vaccines look for profits. AstraZeneca had said we'll give it at low cost, but they hadn't said that no charges for patents. They said we'll of course charge for patents, but we'll give it at low cost. Now they're saying we may go back on charging quote-unquote market rates. We don't know what that means. Now, this would mean for large parts of the world, the poor would not get access to the vaccines because it will be expensive. It's market rate, not given by the state, will be expensive. And even if it's given by the state for weak economic positions that some of the countries are in, it may not be very easy for the countries to do it also. That's why you have 10% people vaccinated in Africa, for instance. So these are the challenges to which now we have Peter Hotez and his group in the Baylor College of Medicine. They have come out with a vaccine, which is I think called Covovax. It's being manufactured by Biologic E in India, 300 million doses. They have made one significant statement that this is going to be open sourced. Anybody can manufacture it. The technology is open. It's made available to anybody. And those who manufacture it will not have to pay any patent royalties. It really comes from the free software movement, open source software movement. Okay. And there is an open biology movement, which also said, how do we get, instead of patents, how do we share this kind of knowledge so that others can use it? And they talked about open source biology. So this is a very interesting development because I think this is the way we have to go. If you have to fight infectious diseases, which are still very much there. Peter Hotez wrote a book, Forgotten Diseases. Clearly, those diseases existed. Tuberculosis, malaria, big killers even today. So the fact that pandemic in COVID-19 terms has made us familiar with diseases again for the rich also means that what happens to the poor when the rich forget that the rest of the world exists, and we have to see how we can provide protection and immunity for them. And that's a public health issue, because as people have said time and again, that if one person is not safe, the world is not safe, because it just needs a new variant to come up anywhere in the world. So everybody has to be safe in order for the world to be safe. This is the issue why we need public health and why vaccines are a public health issue, not a private profit issue.
All right, Prabir, thank you for that. Now we move to Afghanistan, whose embassy and consulates in the US will be shut down. This throws the future of Afghan diplomats into doubt. Many of them risk getting deported to Taliban-controlled Afghanistan. The diplomats in the United States, who number around 80 to 100, have been asked to secure permission to remain in the United States within 30 days. Just a few weeks ago, the Joe Biden administration had basically seized half of Afghanistan's foreign reserves, supposedly to settle cases filed by the victims of the September 11 attacks. We have with us Prashant of People's Dispatch to discuss these developments. Prashant, what does the shutting down of the embassy and consulates mean to Afghanistan?
Right, actually,
to the diplomats.
Of course. Right, actually, the shutting down of the embassy that's in Washington and 2 residences in New York and the consulate in Los Angeles, in some senses, it's a mini story of what happened to Afghanistan as a whole, because the embassy did have the embassy is being shut, these embassies and consulates are being shut down because of lack of resources. Now, it's interesting, the media reporting in many places says that the Taliban is shutting it down, but foreign policy, for instance, has pointed out that it is a US State Department decision, because they don't have the resources to sustain themselves. Now, the important thing to note is that the embassy did have several hundred thousands of dollars, according to media reports, but Citibank basically froze it after August when those sanctions came into place. And so in some senses, it's a microcosm of what has been happening at the larger level for Afghanistan as a whole. And this kind of, although it's in some senses it may look like a minor story, it's a couple of diplomatic establishments, the lives of diplomats are going to be, of course, upended. But it is in its own way indicative of the fact that at every level, starting from say the topmost diplomatic level onwards to the common person on the street, there is the kind of sanctions that have been imposed, the restrictions that have been imposed are basically disrupting every aspect of Afghan life. So which is why it's an interesting point to sort of look at and understand how, because usually global diplomatic establishments do not suffer this kind of fate, even when there is a lot of crisis, for instance. So this, like I said, is a microcosm of the situation right now. As you said, for the diplomats, it's a question of whether they'll be able to remain in the United States. They probably will. Many of them, of course, far more partisan to, they have been working since October without salaries. Many of them also partisan to the former government and not necessarily very enthusiastic about the Taliban, so many might not even want to return there. But I think this sort of shows the kind of overall mess Afghanistan is in, which of course partly is the Taliban's fault, but is as much, if not more, the fault of the United States and other countries which propped up a government for all these years, which invaded the country first of all, which propped up this government, former governments for all these years, and then but built, or in the name, or while they said that they were building a country, and ended up finally building a system so weak that it collapsed just like that. So that way, so it remains to be seen what's going to happen in the future. In terms of diplomacy itself, the Taliban the US and the Taliban apparently are still talking through the intermediaries in Qatar, which is how earlier also discussions used to happen. So it's not that the embassy or the consulates are really going to serve a big purpose that way, but they were essential for a lot of Afghan refugees. For them it could have been a source of help and assistance at a time when many of them are facing a great deal of uncertainty. There was a lot of evacuation of refugees before the United States itself withdrew, so that embassy that way could have been a key point for many of them. So these are some of the, I think, implications of this specific move, but there is much larger question involved.
Okay. So Prashant, what does this mean for Afghanistan right now? Where is Afghanistan at?
Right. So, like I said, the reason I mentioned the microcosm bit is also because the fact that global attention has kind of shifted from Afghanistan right now, because Ukraine is the center of focus. There's a war going on, it's understandable. But it's important to note that the humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan is continuing. It's very, very real. And I believe about 9 million people are on the verge of starvation out of the overall number of 23 million people in highly food insecure environments. Aid agency after aid agency has been saying that, we're just about managing to deliver barely enough aid to prevent a catastrophe or an all-out catastrophe, which is what many organizations were warning about. So, on the one hand, there is definitely economic collapse that is taking place. There is this massive struggle to ensure that this does not deteriorate into a full-fledged economic and humanitarian catastrophe. And in between, the kind of gestures, the moves we saw recently when the United States seized, half of those assets. And said that it would be used to settle the claims of the 9/11 victims. And importantly, even the other half of the assets are not directly going to go to those in power in Afghanistan right now, but through ways in which the United States will determine, right, to direct aid and organizations and such. So this is a really difficult situation right now for the Afghan people because there is a de facto government, and aid agencies have been pointing out that you have to work with a de facto government. There is no escaping it. And we do also know that there are discussions and negotiations going on in the background, but how much of this is really factoring into aid? If it is factoring in, it's not happening quick enough. So we are seeing, a complete collapse of the economy in terms of earnings, in terms of people not being able to, in terms of the functioning of banks, in terms of businessmen for being unable to transfer money abroad. So in multiple ways, there is a general collapse of everyday life in the country. And this is, the impacts are going to be very difficult to calculate because a lot of this you can see immediately on the ground. A lot of this will be apparent only in the coming years as well because society takes a long time to recover from this collapse. And as of now, we do not really see any roadmap forward. There is no talk about, any of those aspects as well. We do know that an Afghan Taliban delegation had discussions with the Western powers recently, but for the West, they would still continue to see Afghanistan as a geopolitical playground. They want to make sure that, especially now it gets all the more important because now that some of these rivalries have further intensified, the contradictions are intensified, so to speak, they would definitely want to ensure that, say, a Russia or a China does not have too much of a role in Afghanistan. So in between all this, ultimately, it's the people who are going to largely suffer, unfortunately.
Okay, Prashant, thank you for that update. Our next story is about sports and the United Kingdom in the context of the Russia-Ukraine war. On the one hand, Wimbledon and the British government are holding discussions on the status of Russian players such as world number one Daniil Medvedev. On the other hand, Chelsea has withdrawn a request for a Saturday match to be played behind closed doors. It is not allowed to sell tickets anymore after the government froze the assets of its Russian owner, Roman Abramovich. We have Siddhant with us to discuss this. Siddhant, how do we make sense of this continuing campaign against Russia and its friends?
It has to be viewed in a wider context, I think, Pragya. First of all, I'm not used to being on this side of this conversation, so if I ramble on, please do cut me off.
I will.
But which is that on the one side, yes, there is this witch hunt, if we may call it that, or this singling out of not just Russian but also Belarusian athletes by a variety of sports bodies across the spectrum, and football is just the peak of that iceberg, I think. Like you mentioned, Wimbledon also now considering the stance of whether Medvedev and other Russian players can actually participate. And what the UK government stand is that, okay, perhaps if they are not flag-waving, flag-carrying athletes as individual athletes, they may be allowed to. But for that, they require to give some kind of clear assurance to the United Kingdom that they do not support the stance of their country with regard to the conflict in Ukraine. Now, this puts the athletes in an extremely challenging situation, as we've seen with artists and other people in the entertainment industry that are working in the West across the board, whether it's opera singers, ballet dancers, composers, and other kinds of artists. So that's one part of the discussion. The other is where things seem to have broadened a bit, and people are actually considering or questioning big football specifically, and how much market forces have changed the fundamental relationship of sport with the people that consume it, fans, people like us.
Okay, and does this mean there's an ideological shift going on in the sporting world, especially with regard to public fund?
Yeah, we can hope. So there are again, it's an ambiguous situation as it stands today. UEFA is the body that controls football in Europe. It has 53 member countries across the continent. Russia and Belarus both remain extremely powerful in that context. Russia, we all know, in 2018 hosted the last FIFA World Cup. Gazprom, which is a gas company, a Russian gas company, the CEO of Gazprom is also the president of the Russian Football Union. They are very well entrenched in the not just in the governance of football in Europe, but also the financial side of it. So UEFA has, of course, cancelled its title contract with Gazprom for all Champions League. It has also gone ahead and moved the final, which was slated to happen in St. Petersburg. They've moved that final to Paris. But what it has not done is it has not cancelled the broadcast of the Champions League in Russia, right? And when asked the question, Alexander Seferin, who's the president of UEFA, turned around and said actually that there's some sense of double standards being imposed on football, where some countries continue to be able to, let's say, import oil and gas from Russia. It's expected that sport, and particularly football, will respond with this kind of blanket attitude of removing all Russian money, Russian athletes, any kind of Russian influence altogether, which is deeply problematic. So that the question has now expanded.
Why do you think it's problematic? What is the problem?
Because that question has now, fortunately, in democracies, liberal democracies in the West, journalists as well as lawmakers are asking questions. If you consider Russian money to be dirty at this point because of their military operations in the Ukraine, then what is your take on Saudi money coming in to, let's say, buy a controlling stake over Newcastle United, another big club that plays in the same league as Chelsea? In fact, the head coach of that club was asked after his last game a question in the post-match conference. Does he not reflect on issues regarding Saudi Arabia's human rights record, for example?
Okay.
Right. So these are debates that are now coming up, and perhaps the same people who were once the loudest proponents of market economics and liberalization and globalization are now coming in and saying we must sit down with all the stakeholders involved and question what our fundamental relationship with the sport is and how we want the future of sport to look. So perhaps harking back to a time when some of the greatest clubs were actually owned by either entities that brought them together, whether it's a steel mill or a shipbreaking yard or a government department. In India, for example, many of us have grown up playing or learning from institution-based clubs. So interesting debates going on, and if not an imminent ideological shift, at least conversations in that regard seem to be happening in football, and therefore it will probably play a wider role in how some of this conflict is construed by the wider world as well.
Okay, thanks for that, Siddhant. And that is all we have today. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram, and please read peoplesdispatch.org. And thank you for watching.